Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another tutorial. This is going to be a different sort of music tutorial. We've been dealing mostly with MIDI sequencers and digital audio workstations in Linux, the ones that are available to us in Linux that work relatively well inside of the Linux environment without a bunch of hacking and trickery. And that has put us mostly inside of LMMS and Qtractor as of late, a little bit in Ardour, although as I've been mentioning, Ardour lacks a little bit in the MIDI capability that we need to do sort of orchestral mock-ups well. So until Ardour has been developed enough where that is not an issue, where we have reliable MIDI on-off events and other functions. Right now we're looking mostly at Qtractor as a means to create a complex MIDI sequence that can also sync to picture for the purposes of scoring to film. We're going to look today, however, at a different sort of approach, which is more of an approach for the classically trained musician, someone who reads music notation, someone who has a literacy for music notation. I'm a classically trained musician. I went to school for music. I've studied, in that sort of arena, and I can look at a score and appreciate the ways in which the score operates on a notation level without just relying on sort of the keyboard piano roll sort of interface that we have in most digital audio workstations. I actually prefer to deal with complex scores in a notation environment because of that. I find that when I write music personally, if I'm writing just music, I can write a lot more quickly, more efficiently, and I write better if I'm writing to score. And some of you may find that. There may be a small niche of people out there that fit into that category. If that doesn't fit you, you should watch this anyway, because I want to show you the ways in which a score, a notation score, is really just another interface for a digital audio workstation. It's just another sort of MIDI interface that has tracks and values and parameters and controllers. And specifically, we're going to be using Musescore. Musescore is an open source music notation application. It's a very, very powerful notation creator and editor. It's so powerful that over 10 years ago, I decided to dump my proprietary subscriptions for Finale, which is a proprietary notation editor and creator. Is one of the top ones. It's used for most engraving that you see in printed sheet music. Is done in Finale. Another well-known one is Sibelius. I find that people that like Mac computers tend to like Sibelius. It sort of goes along with that sort of culture, I guess, but Sibelius has a slightly more sleek sort of look to it, and it has slightly more intuitive layers in terms of the graphic user interface. Either one of those programs, though, represent really the 99.9% of all printed sheet music that you come across is probably engraved in one of those two programs. I dumped those a long time ago for Musescore as it became more robust and more stable. And now we're at a point where really in terms of music notation, in terms of writing, there's really no reason, in my opinion, to spend one red cent for one of those other two programs when you have Musescore. Sort of like Blender has become for 3D creation and animation, 3D modeling and rendering. It is on par with the big studio platforms, and you would say the same thing, I think, about Musescore as it relates to Sibelius and Finale. It is certainly on par with those. Now, one place where people might identify a lack in Musescore will be in its playback functions. Now, I have a few opinions on that. I remember, 20 years ago on Finale, when they were starting to add some interesting capabilities like humanization in Playback, which makes things a little bit off on purpose, like a human would play it, and adding various sampled instrument libraries to the packaged program, and also adding capability to augment those sampled playback. The goal seemed to be, to some people, to get the notation program to play back as if it's a real orchestra. And I learned a long time ago, like I said, about the time when I dumped those proprietary programs for Musescore, I learned that that's a fool's errand. There really is no way to get your notation program to play truly, realistically back. Now, you can get it to play back in such a way that you get a really good grasp and understanding of what your music would sound like with real people, and that's the goal. And I think that Musescore does that. I think that with Musescore's choice and possibilities in their sound font design that they have in there, there's a couple of sound fonts that come prepackaged with it, and also the ability that Musescore has to MIDI export, not only to create a MIDI file, but actually to export its MIDI channels to external players. I see no reason why Musescore really can't do anything that Finale or Sibelius can't do with sampled sound libraries that are MIDI capable. So I want you to think about it in that respect, okay, that Musescore really is not something that we just have to deal with because we've chosen to do Linux. Musescore is, I think, one of the very best notation editors that there is, and it happens to be free and open source. So let's get into it here. This is the project for the Ruins video, and again, the whole point of this video, these videos that I've been making, is that they are an exercise in film score and scoring music to picture. That's the entire point of this little process that we're going through here. I have been composing music inside of a digital audio workstation, but here what I did is I found that you can, I actually knew you could do this, but I haven't done it very much. You can sync your picture directly to your notation program. So in Linux, the way that is done is with Xjadeo. And what you do is you can load in your video in Xjadeo, and then you select down here for Sync Jack, so that it's syncing to the Jack server. You can also set Musescore to export, or rather render out the audio through the Jack server in the preferences, and then everything is working together. And then Musescore will operate in transport as the master to the Jack transport. So it will then run the video end of Xjadeo. It will master it, and Xjadeo will serve as a slave. So it's a very simple setup. All you have to do is load in your file and then set the sync here and make sure that your properties, your preferences, has the appropriate setup. So if we take a look here, just in terms of the input-output, you want to make sure that you're set to Jack audio server and Musescore. Use the Jack audio, use Jack transport. This doesn't matter unless you're connecting some sort of external program that uses Jack MIDI, but this is the general setup. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to play this back, and you can see what I've composed, and then I'm going to discuss the process that I went through, and I'll give you sort of the procedure and a few tips, and try to equate this as best I can to what it looks like, or what it would look like in a digital audio workstation inside of a MIDI sequencer. So let's play this back and see what we get. Okay, so you can hear that the playback actually isn't too bad. It's not really fully realistic, but you can get a very good sense for what this would sound like with real players using the sound fonts. Now, I want to go through some of the capabilities, and already I've demonstrated the video situation. You can see here if I go ahead to any point and then hit play, it will pick up in the score at that point and in the video. So Musescore is an accurate master in terms of this master-slave relationship to Xjadeo through the Jack server. So let me show you a few things about the program in Musescore and the way that you can use this to compose to picture. And again, if you're a digital audio workstation person and you're not literate in music notation, please watch this anyway, because I think it can be very helpful for you. There may be even ways that you can use Musescore without an understanding of notation to write music, or to at least help you format some portions of your project. So pay close attention here as we go through it. You can set Xjadeo, by the way, to sit on top. So if you hit under display here, window on top, it'll stay on the top and you can continue to work underneath that. That's very useful. You can, of course, scale it just by scrolling. I like to work like this. I just put a little, put my video up here in a margin where I'm not doing anything, and I can still see the picture as I'm going along. In fact, maybe I'll do that. I'll just leave that up here in this way so it's out of the way. So first of all, let me explain how this works in terms of syncing to picture. As I said, it is an accurate master-to-slave relationship, and that's important, that whenever we're playing back from the score, that we are accurately presenting the appropriate portion of video that we want to. Knowing that, we can actually create our tempo map in here as its separate track. So what I did is I put a little percussion track up here. I think it's just a wood block or a cowbell or something like that, and I just label it hits. And up here I'm using this just to indicate with a note on a downbeat where the picture is changing. Now you'll notice something is that the tempos are changing quite frequently, and I found that if we stay within 10 beats per minute from tempo to tempo, we don't really notice the tempo changes on playback. I mean, you can notice it if you're looking for it, but when you're within about 10 beats per minute in change, it's really not a significant change, significant enough to notice measure to measure. So we're trying to kind of stay in that realm. The one place where I violate that is right here near the beginning. I get down to 65, and then I go to 80. But you'll notice what we're going from held notes, kind of these long sustained notes, to more long sustained notes. So there's not really a pulse going on underneath that. It's like a retardando, which is a slowdown in the music and then a return to tempo. But mostly we're staying around 80 to 70, somewhere in that neighborhood between the two. We can create a tempo map here by changing the tempo in order to make beats hit specific places. So if I go back and I play from the beginning, you'll watch where the shot changes right here. So I have something happening, and then the shot changes on that spot right there. Just keep watching here. And then we have a change. What I did is I set it so that my hit points in the music always came immediately after a change in the shot. So when the shot changes, then I place my hit right after that. You want to keep in that realm of about 0.2 of a second. And you typically want your moment to happen musically after the thing that you see. You don't really want it to broadcast what's going to happen. So if you're going to error, you want to error on the side of lateness. So I created my tempo map by just going through from the beginning, playing back. I saw what beat I was on in this track when the shot changed, and then I would adjust my tempo accordingly to get it to hopefully arrive at the beginning of a measure. Now, you don't have to have your hits at the beat 1 of every measure, but it is nice to do that because it makes for nice even phrasing. You can certainly have a hit happen in the middle of a measure. It happens all the time in film score. But if you can manage, especially at these slower tempos, to get it to happen at the beginning of a phrase, it just does make for a cleaner writing experience. So I did that all the way through, and you can see as we go through all of my hits, did end up with my changing of tempos. It did end up at the beginning of measures, and that made it a very, very easy process then to write. What you will notice, though, is that the phrases are uneven. Sometimes there's 2 measures to part of a phrase. Sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 2, sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 4. But you're going back between these odd and even numbers of measures between these hit points. Like right here we have 3 measures, then we have 2 measures, and then we have 3 measures, and then we have 3 measures, and then we have 3. And 3 measures at a time is kind of unusual for music. Usually it's an even number, 2 to 4 measures. So you just deal with that by repeating something, or by augmenting or stretching out some time a little bit in the notation to make it work. Now the good news is that because it's film score, the music serves the purpose of the picture, and you can get away with uneven phrases in film music. That's something that isn't necessarily accepted by a listening audience in a concert situation. Unless it's intended, unless that's part of the character of the piece, to have an unusual phrasing. So in film music, you don't really have to worry about how many measures between certain places. All you need to do is manage what you're doing in between, how you're stretching out material before it changes in the next hit, in the next place that you're moving. Likewise, you don't necessarily have to have a hit point in every single transition. It's fine to have a shot change and not have something uniquely happen musically. I just felt that if I'm making a video montage here for the purpose of film scoring, then those shot changes, those perspective changes, those then become the hits in the music where I'm going to be changing my music. One quick issue here to discuss about how to use a notation program to score. We do not necessarily need to write our music in as if we're writing it for people to play. It may not make a whole lot of sense to use a notation program if you're not going to be printing music for people to play on. However, one thing that you can do in a notation program that you can't do in a digital audio workstation is, if the program is capable, you can have instant command over changes in controllers, MIDI controllers. So for example here, we talked about tempo. I have a number command over where the tempo changes without having to go into any other extra interface. I can just click on a place and then add to that there some sort of change. So if I go to my text here, I can add a tempo marking, and I just put in my number and then it adjusts it. It's a very simple, clean way of adding MIDI data. Likewise, in Musescore, as with all the major proprietary applications, when you add various gestures or expressions, they do affect the MIDI controllers in the back end, such that if I put in a crescendo, that will change. That's what this is here. You see it goes from small to big, meaning that it's getting louder. That will actually change the course volume in the MIDI data, and it's very instant. I don't have to go in and draw it or paint it or record it. So every time I put in one of these elements, it's actually adding something to the MIDI data in the playback to get a more realistic playback. As I said, it's been an endeavor of notation programs for some time now, about 20 years, to try to get the playback to be as realistic as possible, or to at least give you the sense of realism. Even these glissandi markings in here, this place where one note will slide to another, Musescore in the back end will actually create MIDI data that would do that if I export the MIDI file and bring it into a digital audio sequencer or a digital audio workstation. So this is very instant in terms of what it's adding with respect to expression by using notation. Dynamics, likewise. I put in a P for piano, and it will bring the velocity layers down so that it's very soft. If I really want to get specific, I remember back in the day when I was using Finale and I was creating music, and then you want in my college composition studio, you want other people in the studio to hear the music you're working on, you would create what's called a playback file. And that's where we had a second version of your notation that had a bunch of extra markings and changes in it that would get it to play back as a person would play it, so that you could get a more realistic outcome from what the notation is. You wouldn't necessarily need to put in all of these markings when you for putting it in front of a person. You could put in a marking one time and just write SIM for similar, and the performer would know to do that. However, on a playback file, because the notation program is quite specific in its instructions that it follows, you would want to put in every single one of those expressions. So we would make these playback files that would have, these holds on it, a fermata hold, a place where a note is being held longer than its value. You might add an extra measure in there and then tie the notes over so that it would actually play back that hold, and various tricks like that. So really what we're doing is we're just making that playback file. We're making a sort of playback a file that will match what we want to have in our digital audio workstation when we finally get to detailing our sequence. And adding these expressions will adjust the MIDI data accordingly. Now, on top of that, like the proprietary programs, Musescore has some MIDI piano roll capability. So, for example, if I select down here on the toy piano, for example, and I go here, I can select on this and go into its piano roll. So if I right-click and I select Piano Roll Editor, I'm looking at a genuine MIDI sequencer. And it's actually showing, where notes are slightly off. See how it's playing back. There's a glissandi roll that's in there, a roll that is rolling the notes, and you can see that the notes from bottom to top are slightly ahead. So the bottom notes are ahead of the top notes. So that's a good example of placing a notation expression on there that automatically edits the MIDI data in the back end without having to do it by hand, note by note. So I can then play back from here, and if I play this back, I can see my MIDI data going. So in a sense, Musescore is a digital audio workstation at the MIDI level without using the audio. It doesn't have any audio tracks to it, but it is a MIDI sequencer. You can sequence here. You can even choose some very basic controls, so velocity and length of notes and whatnot. So yeah, this is a very, very good, useful tool, the piano roll editor in here inside of the notation to really detail it. The nice thing too is that you can edit in the piano roll, make slight adjustments, and it doesn't change what the notation is. It just makes it play back more realistically. So additionally, you can detail your sounds a little bit to get a better sound for the purposes of auditioning what you're doing here. So if we go up here to the view, we can open up a mixer, and this is something that's pretty normal in proprietary notation editors, is to have some sort of a mixer. And what it can do is inside of each one of these channels, you can actually indicate which patch from your sound font you want to use. So by default, my violin section used a solo violin, but I can select that channel and then go in here and select a different patch that more appropriately fits it. So very good control here in Musescore for that. And you can, of course, adjust these faders to get a good sound, an appropriate balance and blend that you want. You can even pan it. Now, what I did is I created my score, and you've heard all of this, and then you export it. I export this as a MIDI file. Now, just a couple of things that you need to be aware of when doing this, because ultimately we want to put this into a digital audio workstation and refine it a little bit more, and that will be the coming tutorial. One thing about this is that Musescore will export all of the tracks that you create. However, some MIDI applications, MIDI-aware applications like LMMS, for example, will not import more than 16 channels of a MIDI file, because a MIDI file is not supposed to have more than 16 channels. MIDI, the MIDI interface only has 16 channels. So it will create a MIDI file that has more, but you won't necessarily be able to use all of those tracks easily inside of your next program in the pipeline here. Okay, so one thing you want to do is make sure that you create multiple MIDI files that only have that has less than 16 instruments. And one way to do that, if I have a big orchestration, is I will export one version. I'll save down to a separate file, and then I will delete all of the instruments except for maybe the strings, and then I will export that. I'll save as And then I can select here various, wrong thing, export, and I can export as a MIDI file, standard MIDI file, just those tracks, just those instruments, and that'll be a string file. And then I'll make another version of it that has just the woodwinds, and another one that just has the brass, and one that just has the percussion in it, so that you have less than 16 tracks per MIDI file. Then what you can do is just import those separate sections into your digital audio workstation. Now, the nice thing about doing that is by importing various sections, it automatically organizes them appropriately in the workstation, in the digital audio workstation. Those tracks will be grouped together well. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I created a track where I could set hit points inside of the mixer. I just turned that track all the way down so I'm not listening to it. Let's see what it is. It is I can't remember what I put on that. I think it was a woodblock sound, but I don't really need to hear it. And then I can notate in here. Now, another nice thing about notation versus a digital audio workstation kind of environment is the ability at which you can copy and paste. Now, I know that you can copy and paste easily inside of a MIDI sequencer, but it just seems even more accessible to do it inside of the notation editor. So I could select two measures here, Control C, go to another place, select the first measure, and then just hit Control V and it will paste it in. I can paste in across tracks or across instruments as well. So I could select several different measures and copy that and then paste that whole thing later on down in the piece. And then I can transpose what I've pasted. So it's just a very quick and efficient way of working with music by working in notation if you're literate. So how can you use notation to write music if you don't read notation? Well, you could just experiment around much like you do with the MIDI sequencer if you just know certain note values. So for example, up here, note values, a whole note is 4 beats, a half note is 2 beats, a quarter note is 1 beat, an eighth note is half of a beat, and so on. And then there are the corresponding rests. So you select rest, and you just experiment around in the same way that you would inside of your sequencer. You put notes in, notes that are separated by 1 line or 1 space or a third apart. You put 3 of those together, and you get a chord of a certain quality. So yeah, don't be afraid of the notation editors. Get in there and do that. Another thing you can do is you can put everything in concert pitch so that you don't have transpositions going on when you have transposing instruments. These are not transposing instruments. These are all in the key of C, but if you have trumpets and clarinets and things like that in there that are transposing, you can set this in concert pitch so everything's the same. You do need to maybe learn to read clefs so that you know what is what between these various clefs. The treble clef, as you should have learned in school, in your elementary general music classes, the lines are every good boy does fine, right? The spaces spell face, F-A-C-E. Everything is in alphabetical order, line space. E, F, G, then it starts over A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. The clef down here in the viola, this clef, which we really only ever use in 2 places. Use it with viola music, and you'll also see this in certain kinds of vocal music, this sort of alto clef here that you see. This clef moves everything down 1 line or 1 space. So the C, which was up here on space number 3, is now on line number 3. So everything moves down 1 space for the viola. The bass clef, in terms of the named notes, everything moves down 1 whole space or 1 whole line. So you have different acronyms to remember these. For example, the lines are good boys do fine always, or great big dragons fly around, or whatever you want to do to remember those lines. And the spaces would be 1 space down from where they are in the treble clef, which would be A, C, E, G, all cows eat grass, or all cars eat gas, or something like that. But just experiment around. That's what you're doing anyway. If you're not fully literate in music, you're doing that in this MIDI sequencer in your digital audio workstation. So, experiment around in notation. But yeah, if you're literate, this is really a great way to write music to picture with the ability to sync video to that and be able to see in real time how it's affecting your picture, the music that you're writing in. So this is my preferred way to do it. And then work down then to an audio MIDI sequencer in a secondary step where you can put on better sounds and add other effects. I knew from the onset that I was going to be creating some unusual sounds for this that I was going to use that I was going to be using together with these string instruments and my little toy piano Celeste sound down here. And I just kind of left that out. I didn't really conceive of where those things would happen other than kind of take mental notes of where they might happen in the score. This is just the instrumentation. This is like a recording session just for the live instruments, and that's how I looked at that. And then what I can do is I can create my sounds later, and then bring my sounds, my extra sounds, my additional sounds into my final cut in the digital audio workstation, and then sequence those clips together with this MIDI data. So that will be what we look at down the line. In the next tutorial, we're going to be looking at creating special sounds. We're going to work on creating some custom sounds, unique sounds that you can use in your sequences that you can either sample and use in a MIDI triggering as a MIDI triggering event, as a sampled instrument, or as I did in this project, you just use the wave samples, the wave sounds, directly in an audio channel inside of your final sequence. And we'll take a look at that and some ideas that go into that and how that can be done. But that's it in a nutshell. Yeah, just a couple comments about the piece in general. I was going for kind of a stereotypical sort of horror, scary thriller vibe here, so I was channeling my inner Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith. The opening was very Bernard Herrmann like, very similar to what you would have heard in a Hitchcock sort of film. And the stuff in the middle had that kind of otherworldly sort of, Jerry Goldsmith sort of sound to it. And I was using harmonic tonal conventions that those gentlemen used in their music, knowingly doing that. One quick noteworthy thing musically here is the use of the dies irae, which is a Latin term. You can look up here. This is a Wikipedia reference. So it's an ancient concept, but it has a musical line to it as well. It is a judgment sort of concept, a day of wrath sort of idea, used often associated with death. Musically, down here, we'll see that there's actually a little tune that was created from a chant, and this little sequence, particularly the part right here at the beginning, ba-da-dum-bum-bum-bum-bum, this section right here, this shows up in everything. It's in everything. You'll see it in film and television. You'll see it in classical music. Even today, composers that are writing new concert works, if it's contextually about death, it probably has the dies irae in it. So I use that because it's part of our subconscious musical vocabulary in Western music to hear that when we're dealing with something that has impending doom sort of to it. So I did use that, and you'll hear that at the beginning of the music and used throughout, kind of in the background. This little motif here applied, the dies irae. So borrow from people, listen to other pieces. I know there's one really good piece of advice out there, and that is to not listen to film score, but rather to listen to classical literature. Listen to music that was written for symphony orchestra or chamber groups and whatnot, and get your inspiration from there. I do believe that that's a good thing to do. However, if you're trying to be idiomatic, if you're trying to write music idiomatically for a particular genre of film or a particular style, I think it's a good idea to listen to film music from those types of films, because if you're trying to emulate something, you want to go to the vocabulary that people are used to hearing. rather than starting from scratch. But in general, I think it is a good idea to listen to classical literature that is not film music to get, compositional ideas that aren't really just an emulation of something else like this piece is. But anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say without getting too deep into what's going on in this piece. Bit of a harmonic journey. We go through a couple of different keys and tonicizations to get to the end. Yeah, that's it. So hope you enjoyed this short little walkthrough of Musescore and just my explanation of the process in writing inside of a notation program to picture with a sync using the jack transport and Xjadeo. So anyway, good luck with that and happy mixing. And in the next video, we'll take a look at creating unique sounds, soundscapes, and creating extra sorts of wave files that you can use in your sequences. So good luck with this, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.